Hey there, it's Donna Doyon. After I recorded and while I was editing episode 69 of my podcast, I had a few thoughts as I was listening to it replay. One of the things that occurred to me was that before I recorded the podcast, I drew an oracle card and I thought it was pretty cool. So the card that I drew is called Fresh Approach. Let's see if you can see that. And I loved this card because as I was writing the Once Upon a Time story at the beginning of the episode, my intention had been to bring the story in one direction. And then the story kind of took over on its own and it went in another direction. And at one point, my eyes had dropped down to this card because I have a little picture frame that I keep by my desk and I put each day's oracle card into it so I can look at it and reflect on the message for the day. And as I was writing this Once Upon a Time story before recording the episode, my eyes dropped down to the Fresh Approach card and I thought, that's why the story was not coming together the way that I thought. And one thing that had caught my attention about this card is the way that this can be like the earth, but I also picture it as just a giant bubble. And it's almost like her hands are grasping it, almost like it's a balloon. And I just kind of, when I looked at this, I thought, it looks like a bubble. It looks like a balloon. And she's holding it and she has the opportunity to just let it go. And then that balloon go all over the place. And maybe that's what I needed to do, was just take a fresh approach. And so the story in this week's episode went in a different direction than I wanted it to. Therefore, the entire podcast episode went in a different direction. During the story, one of the lines I read is that the garden, I'm talking about the garden. Hopefully you've already listened to the episode, but if not, I'm talking about how our personal development growth is very similar to a flower garden, in that we have the option at any given time to change out the colors, the textures, the height, the depth. We can switch out the flowers in our gardens. It can go from being small and dainty to being big and bold. We have that power in our gardens. We have that power in our lives. One thing that I wrote in the story was, I commented that depending on the flowers you have in your garden, that will attract some insects and birds, and it will repel other insects and birds. And sometimes you don't know the impact that a small change might have. I believe it's not dandelions. Most people consider weeds. I think they're gorgeous flowers. I can't think of the marigolds. Marigolds have a strong odor, and I believe that they repel certain insects. And so if you had a lot of marigolds in your garden for years, and then you decided you were ready for a change, suddenly some of the insects and the pests that you never had to deal with, suddenly you may find them in your life because you got rid of something that was keeping them away. So as you're making changes in your personal life, that's something to be mindful of. Sometimes we'll change an activity that will invite the people and the butterflies into our gardens, the ones that we really would love. So play around with your activities. Be mindful of the choices and the changes you make to see what the results are. Because sometimes that you can feel a little unsettled, say, what, I made this change and suddenly I have all of these Japanese beetles in my garden. Well, perhaps just adding a small cluster of marigolds would keep those away. And for any of you who are gardeners, I don't know if marigolds repel Japanese beetles. That's just something that came to mind. That is one of those insects that we deal with here in New England. Another point that I had made at about 4.5 minutes into the podcast, I was talking about small, delicate blossoms that they're barely noticed. That's how I would have described myself many years ago, and in some situations, how I would still describe myself. The thing to remember is just because you're small and you're delicate, when you're in this big, big, bushy garden, sure, you may not get noticed. But when you zoom in and when you focus on that smaller, beautiful bunch of flowers, the beauty and the magnificence of it is still there. So even if you're going through a time in your life where you're smaller and you're kind of delicate, know that your beauty is still there. It still radiates from you. Sometimes it can be overpowered by what's around it, but the beauty is still there. And then just a quick clarification point at around 19 and a half minutes, I was talking about how I consider myself to be a well-manicured garden, very orderly garden. Trust me, that's on the inside, not the outside. No manicures, hair's like this, kind of, just the comfortable t-shirt, sweatshirt look. So sometimes the manicured and the orderliness is on the inside, and it's not necessarily something you see on the outside. So those were a few thoughts that I had as I was doing post-production on this week's episode of Reflections of a Recovering Ugly Duckling. I hope you enjoyed this. Would love to hear your comments, your feedback in the comments. Have a great day, and I will see you the next time.